بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. We wanted to make the second presentation as we planned earlier. We make one presentation which we divided into three parts. The first part we already made. This is the second part. And the second part concerns the definition, concept, and the philosophy of war. And we already stated in our previous presentation that the subject we wanted to raise or to take into this second part is: number one, socio-political definition of war; two, quantitative criteria in the definition of war; three, the judicial conception of war; four, multifactoriality of war causation; five, typologies of war; six, incidents and frequency of wars; seven, violence index of wars throughout history; eight, periodicity of war; nine, population and war; and 10, the conclusion of second part of the presentation. Now, we wanted to discuss the socio-political definition of war. Throughout the history, the scholars of the field used to explain or to define war from different perspectives, from different ages, and from different space, time, and conditions. But we selected the most important scholars that left their concept and theory in this world. The scholars that almost in every academic field their ideas are taught. The subject which I wanted to raise today is the socio-political definition of war. There is a socio-political definition of war by political scientists, historians, psychologists, sociologists, and military analysts. The school of political realism, for example, maintains that nation-states can only realize their national interest by demonstrating their willingness to fight and by making use of wars of various degree of magnitude as an instrument of national policy to achieve legitimate ends. That's, and I quote, Laurel 1977 and Nobel 1977. The great thinker and theoretician Karl von Clausewitz defined war as an act of violence intended to compel our opponents to fulfill our will. And elsewhere, Karl emphasized, and I quote, war is nothing but a continuation of political discourse with a mixture of other meanings. Most scholars in the 19th century and afterward, they agree with this. And this is, from political perspective, the most commonly accepted definition. War is nothing else but continuation of political discourse. And again, it said, war is the highest phenomena of political disagreement. So I think all these scholars, Karl Marx, John Omin, they all get this concept from Clausewitz. Sorel also, on the other hand, defined war as a political act by means of which states, unable to adjust a dispute regarding their obligations, rights, and interests, resort to armed force to decide which is the stronger and may therefore impose its will on the other. The scholar is defining war from the perspective of political side, because he defined war as a political act by means of which states, unable to adjust a dispute regarding their obligations, rights, and interests, resort to armed force to decide. So this is also the Karl Marx definition in other way, because when states fail to accommodate their interest, when they fail to negotiate diplomatically the issue of contention, then the result is going to be war with each other. So it's almost when Karl Marx was saying war is the highest phenomenon of political disagreement. And earlier when von Clausewitz said war is nothing else but continuation of political intercourse. And Sorel's now definition of war, saying war is a political act by means of which the states unable to adjust, that's very important, to adjust their dispute regarding their obligation, rights, interests, or whatsoever. They will resort to the war. Kelly, on the other hand, seems to favor a political definition of war himself too, and he writes, war is an armed contest between two or more sovereign institutions, employing organized military force in pursuit of specific ends. In this definition, he did not include militia or ragtag groups, those who are disorganized but armed people. He did not include war. He said war must be an armed contest between two or more sovereign institutions, employing organized military force. That means disciplined force, a force that taking orders from one place. Johnson, on the other hand, in 1935, defines war as an armed conflict between population groups, conceived of as organic units such as race or tribes, states or lesser geographic units, religious or political parties, economic class. This definition looks at the social aspect of war because it does not limit armed conflict to political units alone, as earlier scholars defined it. Let's also take now the quantitative criteria of the definition of war. Singer and Ismail in 1972 and Dutch and Singerhas 1973 call war any series of events that meets the following three criteria. This is quantitative aspect of the war. When we are defining war from quantitative criteria, it said, A, defining war from the side of size, and they said it results in at least 1,000 battle deaths, not counting therefore the indirect victims through famine, lack of shelter, disease, or hunger, or something like that. They defined war any battle in which the casualties are not less than 1,000 dead. Two, preparations. It has been prepared in advance and or is being maintained by a large-scale social organizations through such means as recruitment, training, development of troops, the acquisition, storage, distribution of arms, ammunition, and making specific war plans and the like. If there is no preparation, they are not calling wars. They call it incidents, upheavals. Wars must be something recruited, trained, deployed, the deployment of troops in a good position, then make storage of logistics, distribution of ammunition, public awareness. It should have all these things. Three, legitimation. It's been legitimized by an established government or quasi-government organization, so that large-scale killing is viewed not as a crime, but as a duty. So in terms of quantitative criteria of definition of war, they said war must possess three things. The confrontation must not be less than 1,000 casualties. Two, there must be preparation for troop employment, logistics, and everything. Three, legitimation. The institutions that is taking wars must legitimize and explain their wars as a legitimate war. That's what every institution or what every government or state or sovereign do. Closely related, we have to look now the judicial conception of war. Closely related to a political definition of war is the judicial conception of war. Marquess de Oliver, for example, is quoted as declaring that war is a litigation or a suit between nations that defended their rights, in which force is the judge and the victory is the judicial award. Kelsen, for example, on the other hand, believes, according to the interpretation of war is neither a delecid a violation, nor a sanction legally approved. It's not illicit because war is not forbidden by any general international law. It followed thus that any state could war against any other state without violating any law. Obviously, no state would violate its own laws in going to war, and in the absence of international law forbidding war, there could be no question of it illicit. On the other hand, war cannot be a sanction either, since there is no international law authorizing war. While every state authorizes its own wars and condemns its enemies, this hardly constitutes a legal state of affairs. War is thus beyond any legal praise or blame. The other position held that there was a general international law forbidding war on principle, except where an illegal act or illicit had been committed. On this account, war is neither blameworthy because it's a illicit, or praiseworthy because it's not a sanction. In summing up this matter of a legal definition of war, Grob, 1949, concluded that there can be no such notion as war in a legal sense. And Wells, for example, in 1967 added, if there were some senses in the expression of legal war, the existence of some international body would assign the criterion for legality would at the same time make the expression odious or contradictory. Number 5, we wanted to discuss now multifactoriality of the war causations. As we stated earlier, war is a complex social phenomenon that there is no single explanation of its causes, preventions, and its definitions. And this is supporting that, saying multifactoriality of war causation. War as a complex, multidimensional social phenomena has so many sources and causes that no theory of a single cause can explain its nature. One cannot find a single necessary condition and a single sufficient condition. One can only try to find sources, factors, conditions important for the occurrence of the war. Williams, 1972. Every war is fought for more than one motive, spurious or real, appreciated or unrealized. Taney and Hyde. One of the most important challenges to the concept of a state as an actor has come from the contention that the behavior of a state is really the behavior of men who act in the name of a state. Those who have power may not represent the national interest, but rather the interests of those groups whose views the decision makers consider relevant. The role that interest groups have in the making of foreign policy of developed countries is a subject of recurrent interest. 3 different groups have been indicated. The first group is big businesses, which it is maintained gains by war through the close ties between business magnates and political leaders. Secondly, special interest has been devoted to the arms industry, which through its direct contact with military establishment constitutes an important lobby. The literature concerning the activity of merchants of death or the military industrial complex, as this combination is called, is quite large. Finally, in some analysis, those who carry out the foreign policy are mentioned as having many opportunities to influence it and as being liable to act in the interest of ruling class. Moreover, it has been suggested that the rules by which international diplomacy is carried out give diplomats an interest in creating tensions and crises even there. They explain it here that multifactoriality of the causation of the war. And one of the interesting things is the impact that the lobbying groups has on the decision making and thinking. For example, the big interest groups, the army industry, the diplomats, the important diplomats, all this play a great role in creating wars. Typology of war, number 6. All right, for example, 1942-65 has developed a typology of war which distinguishes among four criteria. 1. The civil war, which takes place within the boundaries of the sovereign nation. 2. The balance of power war, in which members of a state system are at war among themselves. 3. The defensive war, which acts to guard a civilization against intrusions of an alien culture. And 4. The imperial war, in which one civilization or nation attempts to expand at the expenses of another. Leonard, for example, in 1968, introduces somewhat different perspective in his treatment of war. He places greater emphasis on the motives of the nation-state in their initiation of war. He divided wars of aggression into four categories. Expansive wars are defined as those concerned with the conquest of foreign territories not previously controlled. The Japanese inventions of Manchuria and China is an example of this type, as are the German and Soviet invention of various European countries in the interwar period. 2. Irredentist wars are, according to the Lugard, directed against territories inhabited mainly by people of the same race as the conquerors. The Nazi occupation of Austria, the Sudetenland land belongs in this category also. C. The strategic wars. As a third category may be motivated by desire on the part of the nation to enhance its logistic and military position vis-a-vis some real or imaginary threat. Soviet invasion of Finland in 1939 might have been included by such a perceived threat. Finally, Lugard spoke coercive wars as those wars which entail the placing of the constraints on the operations of the sovereign government. An example of this type provided by Lugard is Soviet's repression of the Hungarian uprising in 1956. Also see contrast in 1979-1990 Nicaragua by US force. So Lugard in general divided wars of aggression, the expansive wars, the irredentist wars, the strategic wars, and coercive wars. They did not divide the types of wars according to the numbers, but they grouped it according to their causes or intentions. The incidence of war. The incidence and the frequency of wars. In modern civilization since 1500, for example, theoretician Q. Wright found that there have been at least 284 wars and some 3,000 battles. He defined battle as involving more than 1,000 casualties on land and more than 500 at sea. A war was a hostile encounter which involved more than 50,000 tribes, or which was legally declared as war. There have probably been over 250,000 such hostile encounters in the civilized world since the year 1500, an average of 500 a year. Finally, there are signs that war has recently become more common. Grievous, for example, 1962 has accounted no less than 14,542 wars in the period of 3,600 before Christ to 1962. According to Kendall, 116 wars, both international and internal, have occurred since World War II, involving 81 states. Approximately 25 million people were killed in those wars. Violence index of the war is another way to measure the atrocities and the effects of war in the society and humanity as a whole. The violence index, or the intensity of wars, shows that even before World War II, violence was more than 25 times greater in this century than the last. It was more than 150 times greater than in the 12th century. Battles are becoming much larger, as their names reveal. They were once called after the bridges or the towns where they took place. By the time of the First World War, they were named after the rivers, the battles of Somme or the region, the battles of Camping. By the Second World War, they were called after countries or oceans, the Battle of Britain, the Battle of France, or the Battle of the Atlantic. The trend appears to lead inevitably to the nuclear war that could be the Battle of Globe, Clark said also. Also, Kinder, discovered how quickly violence was escalating. This is indicating that humanity needs to have a solution. When you look at the index of war, the violence index of war, humanity has no alternative but to face the reality of the war and come up with a solution. That's my explanation. How far? Nearly 90? So far, nearly 90 people out of every 1,000 have been killed as a direct result of war in this century, compared to only 15 in the last. The number of people involved in the increasing number of battles is also getting much larger. The battles themselves last much longer than they used to. Since the Second World War, about 20 million men have been under arms, roughly 7 out of every 1,000, and this excludes the huge numbers of people employed in war industry of various kinds. In the 17th century Europe, only 3 in every 1,000 were under arms. This is very terrible. For example, in other way, if I put this way, for example, the violence index of the war, or as some scholars did. For example, in the Napoleonic era, 1790, 1815, the average deaths per day was 233. The Crimean War of 1854 and 1856, the average death per day was 1,075. The Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913, the average death per day was 1,941. The World War I, 1914, 1918, the average death per day was 5,418. The World War II, 1939, 1945, the average death of World War II per day, 7,738, and Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, 80,000 people perished one time. This violence index is indicating how serious war is to the existence of humanity, and how it's very urgent to address this issue. Periodicity of the war. Another strange phenomenon war has is this one, as many scholars said. They said it has a period. Every period, when certain time elapses, there should be a war. For example, Tchaikovsky, in 1923, a Russian astronomer and psychologist, published what he called an index of mass human excitability. His information was collected from 72 countries and covered the period of 512 Christian to 1922. His principal conclusion was that humans behave excitedly and violently in waves which break upon society 9 times every century. Each wave, he claimed, lasted 11.1 years and reached its peak 1 year before the time of climax of sunspot activity. Wheeler, an American psychologist, followed up the similar study in 1943. His conclusions were no less startling. Civil wars, according to him, occurred in waves with a 170 years period. Every third wave was more severe than the other two, given a cycle of drastic civil violence every 510 years, which also occurred every 170 years. Alright, for example, beliefs also found cycles in human society. Tabulations of the dates at which battle honors have been given to British regiments show a remarkable 50-year fluctuation in the frequency of such battles. He found similar evidence from other battles and in other casualties rate in England, France, United States. His 50-year cycle attributes to the passage of 2 generations. The first is thought to regard war as undesirable, and the second believes it to be romantic. Denton and Phillips, they have this opinion. In 1968, tested both the Richardson and the Q data for the period of 480 to 1900. For evidence of short-term and longer-term fluctuations in war and peace, they found a regular upsurge of violence every 25 years, on average of about 20 years before 1680 and 30 years after this day, and also more extended fluctuation every 80 and 100 years. They also explain shorter cycles as generation effect. Population and war. In cartel, war, population density and urbanization are highly intercorrelated with the dimension of social stress. has, for example, in 1965 concluded that the stress within overcrowded cities bears more relation to the international conflict than the stress associated with life in a densely settled farms. Rommel concludes that demographic variables, population density, birth rate, infant mortality, and rate of population increases were the most important predictors of conflict within and between states. There is a correlation between the degree of foreign conflict and the population density. They mean when the population density is high, that country should seek another space or another resources to satisfy the needs or to cover the needs of this population. So they said the population density and population growth has a relation in the causation of war. Singer, on the other hand, finds no significant association between a nation's growth rate in population or density and its war prognoses. In his study of 93 international wars during the period of 1816-1965, generally an increase in population must bring about increased demands for resources and a greater level of technological development before lateral pressures, competition, and crisis are likely to lead to a violent conflict. However, there is no defined evidence that overpopulation or density per se leads to war. Many densely populated areas in the world have been highly stable, and many states in Latin America and Africa with low population densities have been highly unstable. Werner, 1972. However, the surge for raw materials and the market has often been a prominent cause of international conflict. We have covered the first presentation, and now we covered the second presentation, the introduction to the socio-political definition of war, the quantitative criteria of definition of war. We also covered the judicial conception of war. In this second presentation, we also covered multifactoriality of war causation. We also covered typologies of war. We also covered incident and frequency of war. We also covered in this second presentation violence index. We also covered periodicity of war. And lastly, we covered population and war. We will also cover in the third presentation the military strategy. We will go deep into the battle itself, the strategy, the levels, the organizational, the art of war, the tactics. We will go in deep into this third and the last presentation. In the meantime, thank you very much and welcome.